Welcome to North Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And on the other end of Tin Can and String, the Tin Can and String, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts, most notably from theathletic.com. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, what did you do with your summer vacation?
School. No,
I got a rock.
I went to camp. Mini camp.
You went to mini camp. Yay!
And I met lots of friends.
Were there any swirlies or scary stories around the campfire or anything like that?
There would have been swirlies if Kyle Rudolph had his way.
Yeah, that actually.
Can you give swirlies to a bald dude? Yeah, you can. Never mind.
I mean, at that point, it's all about intent. Just because there's no hair involved doesn't mean that, the effort was made. Just imagine Linval Joseph looking at somebody and going, "Nope, this is happening. You're getting a swirly." Linval.
Wow, rookie hazing has really changed.
It's almost tragic. Welcome to this episode of Norse Code. We're back from our I want to say hiatus, but it was about as planned as possible. This is we're in the throes of the quiet season, other than extensions and random other things. So we're right smack in the middle of all the camps kind of beginning and ending. So minicamp is now finished, correct?
Yeah, we had the final day of minicamp today.
Yep.
It was cut 10 minutes short as a reward to the players.
Well, how about that? Was it through any way of if somebody kicks the ball through the upright, we get to leave early, or was this just a good job? You guys have managed to not get any deweys or do anything stupid during minicamp.
Well, honestly, I have no idea even if it was intentional or to reward. It was just 10 minutes shorter. But I assumed since so many teams canceled the final day of minicamp, it was part of just the general practice of good job, no one got arrested.
That's important. That stuff adds up. I mean, depending on which organization you're at, that is harder to accomplish than others. So
historically hard for the Vikings.
Yeah, let's move past that for just a moment, and want to thank you guys so much for listening and tuning in. And if you enjoy what you're listening to, if you enjoy and get and hear value in the words that we are speaking, you can help us out in one of two ways. You can go to patreon.com/NorseCode, or you can go to paypal.me/NorseCode and give a quick donation there. PayPal is obviously a one-time donation. Patreon is a more of a subscriber base, and give $1 tree fitty to help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay, stuff like that. And I just wanted to make a brief mention because we do have a new donor to mention here, and it's actually Jesse from New York. Jesse, who kind of helped organize the New York show this last year. And he said, "I'm a little embarrassed it's taken me so long to join Patreon, but it was amazing having you guys come to Bar None in New York last year. And the fact the Vikings actually won the game makes it that much sweeter. You guys are always welcome with your Vikings family here in New York City. Keep up the great work." Thank you, Jesse. Yeah, that was a hell of a lot of fun. But you know what's really annoying is
tons of fun.
Yeah, what's really annoying is those the shirts that we ended up getting have been fading quickly through the wash. And I haven't exactly.
Oh, really? Oh, no.
So I may have to put out a call to anyone in the Bar None area for New York to try to sneak another couple of those, and I will compensate you appropriately for another couple of the Vikings shirts, because those were sweet. Those are cool. That was an unexpected fun thing. Also, fun thing, if you are going to be in the Seattle area the day after Thanksgiving, we will likely be doing our live show in Seattle this year. I believe that's going to be November 29th. We will be in the Seattle area. We're just working out details and trying to figure out exactly where we're going to be at. But if you have an idea or a lead, someplace that we should go and record, we should try to nail this down here in a little bit. Even though it's going to be in December, it will be here soon, and we will be ready to field all of the Arif is a Seattle spy questions in person.
Hooray!
The enjoyment in your voice is fantastic. I'm I don't even know how to add. We may have a special guest as well with us for the trip. We are just trying to confirm a couple things, but I may have put a slight dent into his travel budget here coming up.
Okay.
With so I joked, and I don't know what the so in case I've been more active on Twitter lately on my personal account, which
How
is
unfortunate.
a rarity. I know. It's my own fault, really. But so I'm getting married now. The girlfriend stories are now fiance stories, and Dusty is going to be there. So I don't know what the etiquette is for inviting a co-host to a podcast to a wedding, but I am inviting you and your girlfriend simply because if you attend, Dusty and I have a long-standing gentleman's agreement where whoever ends up getting married, the other person has to go up and do the entirety of the Loch Ness Monster speech.
No.
From the South Park episode.
Wow.
So
I have to watch that.
That might be worth hotel and gas up to North
Absolutely.
Dakota. So just wanted to mention that. So that I think that's probably worth that and the red pepper. So just a
right. Okay, I will say A, congrats.
Yay.
B, I think it feels like you've got the causality reversed here. Typically, people's wives leave them and then they get on Twitter more often.
Oh.
Yeah, so this is way ahead of the curve. So
I'd say I'm trying to be like I'm trying to break some sort of spell or try to change the paradigm, do a paradigm shift. No, that's not it at all. No, I'm just, for some reason, I think Twitter is slightly less evil than Facebook, and it's not by much.
Right.
So, moving forward, we have actual Vikings news to talk about with Kyle Rudolph. Kyle Rudolph appears to not be. It doesn't look like he's being traded to New England at all, despite all rumors to the contrary. He has been extended. According to a Ian Rappaport tweet, the details of which are a 4-year, $36 million extension. Rudolph gets $1.625 million additional this year, added to his $6.25 million base, and he gets $9 million fully guaranteed in all, $16 million or so in total guarantees. So
what that means is it's an incredible deal for the Vikings and a very poor deal for Kyle Rudolph. And I don't say this to criticize Rudolph, although I can see why people would think that that's kind of the first direction I would go in. I talked to somebody who's got some experience dealing with contracts and in the NFL about the structure. I think especially after sort of the guarantee schedule came out. And their first response is that Kyle should fire his agent. So, and I don't think you should, because Brian Murphy's an excellent agent and he does, all sorts of things with actually a bunch of Vikings players. He's got a really good relationship with the Vikings. But that tells you, I think, kind of how one-sided this deal is for the Vikings. So there are only $9 million in guarantees for what amounts to, so it's a $36 million extension over 4 years, but it's a 5-year contract because it's in addition to the current year that he's in. So it's like a $43 million contract, $43.6 million over 5 years. But it's being treated as a 36 over 4, so you get the $9 million average that you get to advertise, which makes him the 4th highest paid tight end in terms of new money in average salary. So initially that seems pretty good, and I wouldn't be surprised if this was very similar to the terms the Vikings offered a few weeks ago when Pro Football Talk reported that the Vikings had in fact offered a salary to Kyle Rudolph that was, 5 years, I think was even in the report, that would make him one of the highest paid tight ends in the league. I suspect that the Vikings leaked that report to PFT because all that sounds really good, and Kyle Rudolph rejected it at the time. And I said, well, the reason he probably rejected it is because it has very little guaranteed money, because that's the part of those are the terms that were not leaked, and so that's probably the reason. That turns out to be the case, that he's only got $9 million guaranteed. Tom Pelissero of NFL Network reports that it reduces the cap number by $4 million. And so for something to increase his take-home money. So Ian Rappaport says he gets basically $9 million to take home now. That implies that a lot of it is in signing bonus, because signing bonus gets prorated out over the life of the contract, and it's a 5-year contract, so it's prorated out over 5 years. I should say prorated over the life of the contract or 5 years, whichever is shorter. But so it gets prorated out over 5 years. So I suspect it's somewhere around $7 million, $8 million in signing bonus and $1 to $2 million in base salary. When you divide that 7 or 8 into 5, you get enough to reduce the cap hit by about $4 million. So that's what ends up happening. What that means is that if the Vikings wanted to cut Kyle Rudolph before the 2020 season, and I suspect his base salary becomes fully guaranteed on, say, the third day of the league year, which is how these are often structured, which is why it would be guaranteed for injury, $16.25 million guaranteed for injury. So I suspect he's got a $7 million base salary in 2020 or somewhere around there. Then, they would only incur. So if they decide to cut him before the third day of the league year of 2020, and this is kind of speculation, then the dead money cost that they would incur is only the rest of that signing bonus. So let's say it's between the two. Let's say it's $7.5 million. Then the signing bonus is like 1.5 over the course of the next 4 years in terms of the cap hit. And so that's only $6 million. So they incur maybe a $6 million, and it could be 5 to 7, but let's say around a $6 million cap hit if they decide to cut him in 2020. That's pretty tough. But if the alternative is a $9 million cap hit, that's easier to swallow. And then it's very easy to get out from under the contract by 2021, 2022, or obviously 2023, where you only have a $1.5 million dead hit. And if he costs, and assuming it's an escalating salary, right? So let's say he gets, $1 to $2 million base this year, $7 million or so next year, which is kind of, I think, what the guaranteed for injury kind of implies. And then it could be like $9 million and then $11 million and then $13 million or whatever. I don't know how that math quite works out, but it is possible for the final years to be about $25 million, the final 2 years. So if you're worried about an $11 million or a $13 million cap hit in 2022 or 2023, and you only have to be concerned with taking on, $1.5 million or $3 million in dead space, you can free up $8 million or so by cutting him in 2021 or 2022. So it's only 1 year guaranteed, but really, potentially, functionally 2 years guaranteed. And so it doesn't really extend his time with the Vikings all that much. The Vikings did sacrifice something. They sacrificed their ability to get a compensatory pick if he, signs with another team, because they would essentially have to cut him for him to sign with another team. And, you don't get compensatory picks for cutting guys or for guys who were cut. So they did sacrifice something, but in the end, they got a lot of flexibility and control. They lowered a cap hit. He's a talented player, and so you get to keep him. And so it really helps the Vikings out in a lot of different ways without committing to Rudolph in the long term. So I suspect this is why Rudolph kept kind of rejecting, or Rudolph's team, I should say, kept rejecting the contract that was offered. But the Vikings were apparently able to play hardball. Maybe they had a trade offer kind of in hand. Or they maybe even could have credibly threatened to cut him. I don't know. But they clearly had a lot of leverage. And then also, it's very clear that Rudolph is very invested in Minnesota. Even just based on the statement he released after the extension was announced, essentially by him, that he's got kids here in Minnesota. He's entrenched in the community in Minnesota. He does tons of community work. Everyone kind of remembers the Walter Payton Man of the Year campaign that he was a significant part of, and the leading vote getter, but he didn't win it, I guess. So what weight does the vote have? I don't know. Yeah. But he was the leading vote getter for his work with the Children's Hospital. So it's very clear that he values the community a lot and that he wants to stay in Minnesota. And the Vikings potentially could have used that as a leverage point as well. If they know that he's going to take a lot less in order to be able to stay. So I think that probably has a lot to do with it.
So on a scale of Albert Haynesworth to Richard Sherman, how terrible was this for him then?
But that's a great scale.
That encompasses a lot.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I mean, it's not quite Richard Sherman. But probably Russell Okung's first deal. Okay. It's pretty bad. A first deal without an agent, I should say.
Right.
The one he famously negotiated without an agent. It was pretty bad. It wasn't as bad as the Sherman.
He was so proud of that.
He was. It had a lot of big numbers in it. And I don't want to diminish his intelligence or whatever by saying that, but it was a really bad deal.
No, it stunk on ice. It was terrible. And it's clear there was interest in Kyle Rudolph from the main team that had been rumored, the Patriots, because today the Patriots traded for a tight end, also from the NFC North, which I just assume had to do with spite.
Right, yeah. It is funny how a day after the deal was announced, the Patriots completed a trade for tight end Michael Roberts, who I actually kind of liked coming out of Toledo, but I guess the Lions had 4 tight ends that they would keep over him, so it kind of doesn't matter. But including a guy they drafted 8th overall. I kind of suspected actually that if the Patriots were not going to be able to grab Kyle Rudolph, that they would just kind of punt on the tight end position and just reinvent their offense for the 5th time. I guess they decided they do need some tight ends, and it's not like they're totally bereft of tight ends, but yeah, maybe they were kind of maybe not banking on Rudolph. But they were kind of pretty heavily in the chase, and they went to one of their backup scenarios for resolving that problem. But yeah, I think the timing of the Michael Roberts trade is pretty clearly an indication that they were in the market for Kyle Rudolph, and then after the extension.
Yeah, and when I read that the tight end was from the Lions, my first thought was, oh, they actually went the full route and are trading for baby Gronk. That's what they're doing, huh? Oh, it's one of the backups.
Yeah.
I had 6 text messages to my buddy who's a Lions fan, just all lined up and ready to go until I saw that, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe your coach isn't some sort of spy for the Patriots or something, because it's not like the Patriots would ever be involved in some sort of spying or something like that. Let's talk minicamp, and there's a lot of things to go over, including the O-line organization and a clear winner as to who's going to be starting at center, which wasn't really a competition to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, the Vikings were kind of before OTA started, were very kind of insistent that this is going to be kind of an open competition at center, that we're going to play the best 5 and figure out kind of where they go. And they never moved Garrett Bradbury from center. He is the center, right? They never moved Pat Elflein from guard. He's a guard. Josh Klein is the other starting guard. I think he's starting at right guard and Elflein at left guard. So that's what the O-line looks like. Brown O'Neill is still in the right tackle spot. Riley Reef is still at the left tackle spot. And that's the O-line that they've featured every single day the first team has been out there of OTAs and minicamp. So, yeah, I think we've got a clear center in terms of, who won the job. This is kind of the presumption, of course, going in, but, it's good to get confirmation. And then, the way the coaches talk about, how great Garrett Bradbury is at doing center stuff, like leading the line and, making the calls and acting and carrying himself as a professional like a center should or whatever. No, I'm not saying any of that's unimportant, but it's very difficult to evaluate on my end. So I'm just kind of running through all the cliches that coaches will often use because they know that we don't have contradicting information. So, the way that they talk about him, it's pretty clear that they see him as the center.
So what else is kind of shaken out as far as the offensive line goes?
So I think beyond that, you could take a look. I think left tackle, the backup left tackle, Aviant Collins, I'm not going to say is a dark horse or kind of sneaky, but he's been kind of forgotten because he was injured all of last year. I think he may be an actual contender to take the primary backup tackle spot from Rashad Hill, who, again, I actually think is one of the better backup tackles in the NFL. It's very difficult to find. very good backup tackles. They tend to start very quickly. I think Jeremy Parnell, for example, from Dallas, now I think he went to Jacksonville. I don't know if he's still there, but is a really good example of a backup tackle that was an above average backup tackle, and immediately, he found a starting contract. So I think the only example of a team being able to keep their backup tackle is Washington with Ty Nsekhe, who is actually just a starting quality tackle. He's not even better than backup tackles. He's just a starting quality tackle. But now with kind of all this business with Trent Williams, now he's going to be the starting tackle again. But they were able to keep him. So that's maybe one of the only examples you can find. So Rashad Hill, I think, is better than the average backup tackle, and the Vikings are in a good spot with regards to that. But Aviant Collins, I think, is kind of genuinely in that competition to be the primary swing tackle, which is great because, I think the Vikings see a lot more position versatility with him than they do with Rashad Hill. Beyond that, Drew Samia is still with the third team. Oli Udoh is still with the third team. It'll be interesting to see if they kind of move up. Sometimes we see a player on the third team offensive line the entire training camp, mini camp, and OTAs, and then the guys above them get cut and they get to stay. That's not always the case, but while we should kind of presume for now that they're going to be third on the depth chart and kind of on the outside looking in, it's not like impossible that by the time training camp breaks that they'll not be on the second team or whatever. So that's kind of an update. Storm Norton is the third team kind of left tackle, and the Vikings are fairly high on him, but I think he's just going to get pushed out of the shuffle. And then we see Danny Isidora. I think he's on the third team if I'm remembering correctly. I think he's kind of fallen off in terms of the Vikings' favor, and we're seeing the new guard, I think from the Jets, Dakota Dozier, taking second team reps and so on. So that's kind of how the backup situation looks. The most intriguing, of course, will be Oli Udoh and Drew Samia, who are rookies this year.
So we can move from offensive tackles to defensive tackles, and what's that battle looking like?
So that one's kind of difficult to kind of parse out. So one of the problems is that Linval Joseph has not participated in team drills at all, and it hasn't even participated in any of the drills where the defensive line just kind of lines up. He's participated in some of the individual drills, a lot of the agility drills, but because he hasn't participated, we haven't had a true nose tackle, and it kind of shifts the shape, I guess, of the defensive tackle lineup. And so you've got both the backup nose tackles as your starting defensive tackles. So that makes it very weird. So Shamar Stephen and Jaleel Johnson are both playing, three technique or nose and are just kind of switching off. And from what I could see, Jaleel was playing nose much more often and Shamar was playing three technique much more often. But Chris Thomason at the Pioneer Press tweeted out kind of basically the opposite. So that'll be interesting. I'll probably pay particular attention to that once training camp starts to see if Linval Joseph is still playing and B, kind of where those two end up. But that makes it kind of difficult to tell if any of them are actually in contention to be the starting three technique, because it could just be that, the offensive line needs to compete against kind of established players that have NFL quality, regardless of whether or not they play nose or three technique, and that they haven't figured out who the starting three technique is. And so they're just kind of battling it out, amongst the second and third teams. So, or it could just be that Shamar Stephen has actually just won the three technique job, or is at least the leader in the clubhouse for the three technique job. And we'll see that once training camp starts. So that's kind of all interesting, but obviously the more interesting stuff is kind of what's happening below that. So the defensive tackles have been participating essentially in pairs. So Curtis Cothran and Jalen Holmes are paired together, as are Hercules Mataafa and Armin Watts, who are the two, I guess, relatively younger. But, I mean, they're all, within the last 3 years have arrived on the team. And so Fadi Odenigbo has moved to the outside, and we haven't seen very much of his brother Tito Odenigbo, who is a defensive tackle. So he's the odd defensive tackle kind of out with regards to that rotation. So for most of OTAs and minicamp, we saw Jalen Holmes and Curtis Cothran taking second-team reps. Very often, Jalen Holmes at the three technique spot and Curtis Cothran at the nose tackle spot, but again, kind of switching around. It doesn't matter. They're both natural three techniques. And then after that, we saw Hercules Mataafa and crap, I already forgot the other. Oh, Armin Watts, the 6th round pick that they got this year. On the third team, they're also trading off between nose tackle and 3 technique spots. And it's kind of funny because Mata is 275 pounds, and so sometimes he's playing nose. But recently, the past, I want to say 3 days, so I think the entirety of minicamp, we saw Mata with the second team, along with Armin Watts. I say Mata because he's the one that's like kind of grabbing all the headlines because Zimmer kind of praised him on KFan, and then we've been talking about him a lot, and also he's kind of an interesting story. So those two have been playing on the second team, and we have even occasionally seen, perhaps as part of a nickel package or whatever, we have occasionally seen Mata take occasional reps with the ones, but I don't think that means he's the leader for the 3 technique spot. I think it's kind of up in the air. But we haven't seen a resolution of that yet. And genuinely, I just don't think that we're going to see one until the pads come on day 3 or day 4 of training camp. I would say the most likely guy, aside from Shamar or Jaleel, who are still both in contention for the 3 technique spot, which, by the way, Jaleel played 3 technique at Iowa, even though he's like 330 pounds. But the Vikings mostly consider him as a hybrid 3 nose, kind of the same way they consider Shamar a hybrid 3 nose. And I think Zimmer said in the past that maybe 3 technique is the more natural position for Jaleel. So it's not as if he's not kind of in competition for that spot either. And it would be kind of funny if the Vikings, played with 2 just enormous defensive tackles in the center after Zimmer's history of playing just crazy undersized guys along the defensive line. Because even like D'Amato Pecco was relatively smaller for a nose tackle. And then you've got Geno Atkins, who, his whole career he's been called undersized. And, next thing you know, Zimmer's lining up 2 330-pound defensive tackles. But yeah, it's a competition that I think is more open than any other competition in camp, because the offensive line competition just kind of closed up really quickly. And we'll talk about the wide receiver battle maybe, in the next couple of minutes, but that one seems to be just a little bit more closed off than the defensive tackle one. But yeah, there's a bunch of different like body types and backgrounds at defensive tackle. You got guys that at the combine, they weigh 252 or 265 or 280 or 290, or in Armin Watts' case is 300. So from 250 to 300 pounds. You got guys between 6'1" and 6'5". It's a totally completely separate group. And it's weird because there's just so many. There's some former defensive ends. There's a guy that they tried at linebacker for a hot second. There's, obviously natural 3 techniques at defensive tackle, guys that played defensive tackle in college but had to put on a bunch of weight. There's a bunch of different background styles and body types at defensive tackle.
And the big news coming out of, I think it was yesterday, was the discussion about the wide receiver 3 position, and Chad Beebe was getting some audible praise.
Yeah. Even I think Kubiak brought him up unprompted today in the presser, called him Beebs, actually, which now you have to fight Tom Cruise.
Yeah, that is how that works.
I think that I think that BB is probably the easiest name to kind of pick out. Because he was kind of exciting and he actually played last year from scrimmage. But it should be noted that he was actually the 3rd candidate to take those reps. So first, it should be noted again, and I say this all the time, but I want to repeat it. It's sometimes kind of difficult to figure out who the wide receiver 3 is, because even on the first team, they'll rotate through the wide receivers very often. Now, I think in minicamp, we actually saw a little bit less of that, so it was pretty clear. But Jordan Taylor was almost always the first one to take wide receiver 3 reps. And he was the guy that took wide receiver 2 reps on the days that Diggs wasn't able to make it because of personal reasons to OTAs. So Taylor is the one that was kind of in line for wide receiver 3, but then he's been sidelined for the past couple of days, and he's got a history of injury coming from Denver, and he's had a couple of hip surgeries, and so those injury concerns are something that we should probably closely monitor. But I think he's been kind of the wide receiver 3. That doesn't always mean a ton, because as that was brought up in my Q&A at The Athletic. someone else asked the question, like, how much does it mean? I mean, maybe he's just a veteran, right? And they're just giving kind of deference to veterans. But by the time the season starts, they'll play the best guy, and maybe, that veteran deference will kind of disappear. Remember what happened with, like, Michael Floyd. But there have been other examples of veterans that they've brought in that haven't taken wide receiver 3 snaps. I think maybe Tavares King is maybe the best example. But, Michael Floyd, I think maybe he just got derailed because he was suspended for so long to begin the season. It was very difficult for him to get back on the team and get back in sync. Because I think he had to stay away from practices too. So, which is all it was all a bizarre situation. If you remember the kombucha and all that. Yeah.
It was something in Floyd. I'm trying to remember who it was. Rudy and Floyd. That's what the episodes were supposed to be. Yeah. With Dustin.
Yeah. The second, the spin-off episode of our sitcom.
Yes.
Of Reggie and Vince.
It's my turn with the Heisman.
You had it last week. But yeah, I thought he looked pretty good before. He's kind of forced out for whatever reason. And to be clear, we'd never get clarity on injuries in minicamp. The fact that we got any clarity on Linval Joseph having some surgery with his shoulder and arm, is I think surprising. I think maybe Zimmer was probably caught off guard by the question or something. But the fact that we got clarity on Linval's injury is an exception, or rather the reason Linval was missing team drills is an exception. Whereas, we have no idea what's keeping Jordan Taylor or Smith or the other tight end. What's his name? Tyler Conklin, the guy they drafted last year. Good job, Arif. From playing, because they just don't have to disclose injuries, so they don't. I think as we get to training camp, they might be just a little bit more specific, but it'll be kind of like the way that hockey teams are specific when they say, yeah, it's a lower body injury or it's an upper body injury, and those are the two you get. We'll get a little bit more clarity, but we don't know what that is. And then after Taylor went out, Brandon Zylstra played almost all of the snaps that Taylor was playing. So it wasn't Beebe, it was Brandon Zylstra, which is interesting in part because, Beebe and Zylstra were on the active roster last year together, and Beebe got more snaps from scrimmage while Zylstra was kind of relegated to special teams roles. But Zylstra was taking all these snaps, and he looked pretty good doing it too. It wasn't even like it was kind of like courtesy or anything. He was able to beat Trey Waynes in a couple of plays too. So he looked pretty good. Then we saw Chad Beebe. And then I think after that, the wide receiver 3 job is probably kind of next in line is probably Dylan Mitchell, which tells you a lot about, how far Laquan Treadwell has fallen, mixing up the first rounders I didn't like. But Treadwell hasn't cracked much of the first team. Now, again, because there's a bunch of rotation that occurs, he has taken reps with Kirk Cousins, right? Like he has been on the quote unquote first team offense. But in terms of the way that wide receiver rotation is shaken out, he's taken very few. It seems like he's very much not in consideration for the wide receiver 3 role. Whereas last year, and remember, he had a really good camp last year. There was a lot of talk about him potentially stepping up and developing as a wide receiver 3. And this year it's just kind of not happening. But yeah, the 2 rookies, Dylan Mitchell has looked a lot better, or 2 drafted rookies, I should say. Dylan Mitchell has looked a lot better, and he might be kind of the next in line, say if Chad Beebe gets injured. And he's looked really good in camp. His ability to track the ball is not always completely there, but it's not, disastrous. It's not like John Ross levels of like, what are you doing? And it's certainly not like, what's his name, 2005 draft pick to replace Randy Moss.
Troy Williamson.
Yeah, it's certainly not Troy Williamson. But he gets deep behind the defense. He's been able to catch quite a few balls. So, and that's pretty good. And then the undrafted rookie that Sam Ekstrom likes a lot has looked really good. Davion Davis from Sam Houston State, who I've done very, very little cursory research on. So I don't actually know that much about him. But he's looked really good in camp too. And so those are the guys probably to pay attention to. The other draft pick, BC Johnson, has not looked very good in camp. And that's kind of, it's not depressing, but it's like, that's a shame. And then some of the other undrafted free agents haven't really stood out in the same way that Davis has. But I would say that Beebe being the wide receiver 3 is potentially a product of circumstance. And then also Jeff Badet has been injured the whole time. It seems like whoever wears number 13, which kind of an appropriate number for getting injured all the time. It was happened to Stacey Coley, now it's happening to Jeff Badette. But he hasn't even been on the field, and he's probably in consideration for wide receiver 3 as well.
Well, I mean, it's not like he's getting trapped in an elevator or anything.
Right.
Which we should just briefly mention. That was Linval, right?
Well, it's also not real, but yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought, I wasn't entirely sure. I just remembered, see, my mistake is reading something on Twitter and assuming that it's real, which I'm still convinced that Eddie parentheses dog is actually a dog tweeting. I might not be wrong on that. No, I for whatever reason, I remember reading about Linval getting trapped in an elevator, and I didn't look into it. Just went,
oh yeah, it was NFL Insider Lenny or something like that.
Okay, I was just like, I hadn't actually looked into it. I was just going to make fun of it. Yeah, well, yeah. Of course.
But yeah, Linval got trapped in the elevator for 11 hours. Well, no updates.
I hadn't read the 11 hours part. Admittedly, that probably would have sold me. I feel like that would have been a bigger story. Like it would have turned into like the Bart Simpson down the well thing, and we would have had like people like out there, singing songs. Sting would potentially be there to like try to open the doors. Like there's options. There's places you can go to with that. So. Let's head over to the mailbag. This is going to be a shorter episode because it is deep in the off season, but we want to start off with an important question that you began to tackle during your Q&A today. And the question was, it began with, does O'Neal look bigger and or stronger? And then the question was, is he bigger than James?
So he's certainly taller.
I'm 6'5", and he is taller than me. That is, I do not envy him.
He is an eighth of an inch shy of 6'7".
Jeez.
He's pretty tall. He showed up to the NFL Combine at 297 pounds. He has since gained weight. We presume good weight. Because the Vikings have been happy about it and are not complaining about it, so that's good. And we don't know kind of what that weight is. I wouldn't be surprised if the target was 310, 315, but given his height, it might even be up to 320, which would be pretty incredible if he looks like that at 320, which would tell us that, were you both put into a giant cup of water, more water would perhaps spill out of your cup. So in some senses, he is in fact bigger, but in other senses, he doesn't, manage quite the same displacement. So obviously that means he's got a lot of work to do.
You've been real creative in the comments about fat today, and both in the pre-show and in this. So I just want to say kudos to you. And,
I am not a fat shamer. So
no one said you were a fat shamer, and I am actually in the process of losing weight, and I just bought the world's biggest bike. So there is that. But I wanted to quick mention this question because Rick Z had responded with, I like to imagine you two walking around New York City with him carrying you in his breast pocket like a little bearded pocket square. I fear this says either too much about my state of mental health or too little about a decent t-shirt idea. Perhaps both.
I will neither confirm nor deny the rumors that you carried me around New York in your shirt pocket.
Meanwhile, the pocket square has a little The Athletic logo monogrammed on it.
I have gotten a lot of athletic swag over the year.
God. Let's go to Kenneth Allen, who says, with Rudolph seemingly staying, what madness can we get up to with two athletic tight end sets?
I think you can get into a lot. I actually detailed a little bit of it into my Irv Smith article, which I think is still my pinned tweet. It's been a while. I should probably update my pinned tweet. But I think what ends up happening, and we haven't actually seen a lot of this in camp yet. I should clarify that the offense has looked fairly traditional. The defense is not. The defense is just like full go. 10 of you are returning starters. Everybody knows everything. Let's just put new stuff in. And the offense is just like, I have no idea what the name of this play is. So they're like at completely different levels right now. But the offense has looked fairly traditional at the moment. Obviously, they're running a lot of wide zone. They've been running a lot of play action over the past couple of days, which of course has led to a bunch of reporters asking coaches about play action, and Cousins, who actually gave a really good answer on that. But a really good answer that nevertheless was not entirely true, but in his favor. So we'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, we'll see, I think, more two tight end sets. Actually, in the Q&A, someone broke down the numbers for me. I don't even have to do the work. They said that the Vikings were in 11 personnel 68% of the time and in 12 personnel 19% of the time. Do you think that they'll increase their usage of 12 personnel, substantially? And I think, yes, they'll increase it substantially, perhaps even, doubling that. And they also, by the way, gave the added context that the Eagles led the league last year, and of course with, guys like Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert. Why wouldn't you? But they led the league last year with 36% in 12 personnel. So still not, a majority of the time they're on the field, and perhaps not even a plurality of the time they're on the field, but a pretty significant portion. And I would say that the Vikings could be on a path that would, get close to matching that, maybe 34, maybe even doubling the 19%. So we'll see substantially more 12 personnel, but to be clear, that doesn't mean that's going to be their kind of primary formation. I still think there's going to be majority 11 personnel on the field. And for the people who I should have just started with this, aren't caught up on the terminology of that, the digits in the numbers refer to running back, then tight end. And because you can only have 5 eligible skill players on the field at the time, the remainder, -5, is the receiver. So 12 personnel is 1 running back, 2 tight ends, 12. 11 is 1 running back, 1 tight end, so you got 3 wide receivers. But actually, when I asked Stefanski, hey, you haven't had any healthy tight ends. Kyle was gone for a hot second because he was, at a golf event put on by Nationwide to kind of, celebrate the nominees for the Walter Payton Man of the Year. So he was gone for a day or 2 or 3.
Was that when he decided to dunk on Andy Carlson?
Yes. Actually, some people got mad at me because I said he was at a golf event. I thought it was very neutrally worded. I asked somebody there, so Kyle Rudolph is absent. He's apparently, doing a golf thing. And I asked, hey, is it a charity golf event? And they would say, that's probably not the right way to characterize it. But then they didn't give me any further details. So I just said golf event. And some people were like, oh, Arif, you thought he was just out golfing. And I was like, well, I didn't say just. I just said he is gone at a golf event, which is correct. And I thought it was neutrally phrased.
And then he dunks on Andy, and
then he dunked on. Well, Andy said, "Well, I thought leaders are show up, right?" Which fully deserved, Andy.
I'm not a fan of people tweeting the player in this instance, and he was tweeted at, or a response to Andy's was. But I did just have a moment of, oh, that hurts.
Crushed. Because. Kyle doesn't really leverage the I work with sick children thing because it's very crass to leverage it. But this is a pretty appropriate time to, 'cause he won an award for it. He nearly won an award for it. He was recognized for it, I should say. And that's the reason he was absent. Okay, so A, fully deserved Andy. B, it's Andy. You don't got to go on Twitter and dunk on him. No one cares. I love you, Andy. But
you didn't need to use the sledgehammer. The steel chair would have been just fine. Right. But
I thought actually the very Minnesotan appropriate response would have just been, it sucks so much that I had to miss time with my team, but I really wanted to celebrate all the great work I've done with Nationwide, which was pretty close to one of the tweets he had about a day ago, which was, landed in Ohio with Nationwide doing, a golf thing or whatever, which I'm obviously paraphrasing. That would be a terrible thing to tweet. But, something like that. But it would have been a great subtweet.
I was gonna make some comment. Clearly, Arif doesn't handle his own Twitter feed.
Right. But so I was like, okay, so Kyle Rudolph's gone because it's basically an excused absence or whatever. Conklin's hurt. I guess Irv Smith was still healthy at that time, but now he's been hurt. Presumably he's been held out of practice, and David Morgan's been held out of practice this entire time. So does that change? And the thing is, they were running 3 tight end sets in red zone work, and I was like, those are the 3 tight ends you have? That's interesting. It's like Cole Hicatini and Brandon Dillon get to have their days.
It's the Rumsfeld thing. You don't go to war, you don't go to army. You don't go to war with the army you want. You go to war with the army you have. In this case, you have that. Just ask the Cardinals about their playoff runs in the last 5-10 years. Simple as that. Well,
but yeah, so but so I asked him, hey, you're missing like 3 tight ends. Does this change what you do? And at the time, they're also missing 3 wide receivers. And he's like, yeah, you got to treat it like a game, and you have to approach kind of this practice now with that in mind and kind of change what you do. And maybe you go into 21 personnel, which actually I hadn't even considered, which is dumb because the Vikings are kind of one of the last teams that regularly rosters a fullback and puts them on the field. And he's like, yeah, so you could have Kari Blasingame out there, or you can have, CJ Ham out there doing some of the same things, which I thought was kind of fascinating. So it might not just be 12 personnel. We may see a very long-winded answer to your question. We may see 21 personnel as well, just because this is something that they've now practiced more often in the offseason just by circumstance. So, keep that in mind. Obviously, as a quote-unquote heavy formation, it's not going to be as efficient or get as much stuff done, but it'll at least be schematically interesting.
So, next question is from Raul, who asks, after the Rudolph signing, I assume there will be a lot of odd men out. Who is the even man in? Waynes, Alexander, Weatherly, Harris, Curse?
Even man in. I like that. If Marcus Epps continues to ball out, and a lot of it's at like nickel corner and not technically at safety because he's the 3rd-team safety, but he's been doing a lot of 2nd-team work as the nickel corner. But if he continues to ball out, I think that might be harmful to Jalen Curse's prospects. So that's something to kind of consider. I think it's really difficult to keep Mackenzie Alexander, not because he'll be very expensive. I kind of doubt he will be. But and he played really well last year, and I think that kind of just went under the radar. But you have so many cornerbacks that you like, and Chris Boyd looked pretty good the past couple of days. You've got Holton Hill, who next year will presumably not have to enter the season on suspension. You're going to have Chris Boyd, who in theory is kind of beginning to look good. It might be tough to keep Mac, and then obviously you've got Mike Hughes coming back. So you might not keep either Waynes or Mac. And then who are my other options here? I had Weatherly, and then who else?
There was Weatherly, Alexander, Harris, Curse, and Trey Waynes.
Oh, Harris is the even man in. And that's not to say that Weatherly is gone. I don't think they've got quite the same defensive end depth, but they do have a particular proclivity of just producing defensive ends from the 3rd or 4th round, or even the 5th or 6th round, or I guess undrafted as well, that end up kind of performing at a high level, and they always tend to have like some pretty interesting defensive end depth once camp starts. So, and Afadi is back at defensive end, and so that might create some pressure to get rid of Weatherly. But I think it's just harder to keep Weatherly than like Harris, who's played very well, and especially in this kind of limited time when Andrew Sandeo was out. So, and the Vikings made a conscious choice that Harris is definitely a good enough starter that we can kind of let go of Sandeo. So I think they're going to prioritize Harris in some way.
Next question is from Eddie the Dog. I have dog in parentheses here. Will we sign another no-name tight end prior to training camp? And if so, will that be will that be enough to elicit more lots of games left Baywatch pics from Rudolph's Instagram?
I'm kind of confident they will sign some random tight end. Maybe one just familiar with Kubiak. I think because they kind of do this a lot. Like they signed Corey Sperry, I think the first year with Turner, who's familiar with Turner's system in San Diego. They signed Mike Higgins kind of right before camp, who he had like a 42-inch vert or something crazy like that. He's like this weirdly athletic tight end for a guy who no one had heard of and I don't think has done much since. But I feel like they just keep on bringing in like random tight ends before camp starts. So that's something to keep in mind now that you've got this potential injury problem. Yeah, you might as well.
Apparently we just need all the tight ends. Like last year, we needed all the corners.
Yeah.
Roundy Mass asks, what's more likely? The Twins lose in 3 to the Yankees in the 2019 ALDS, or the 2019 Vikings lose the 2019/2020 NFC Championship game on a missed kick?
I feel like a Yankees sweep is less oddly specific, especially given the Twins' like mental hysteria about the Yankees.
No, it's a well-earned hysteria.
Yeah.
It's confirmation that not only are the voices are real, but they're accurate as well.
You're right. So I would say because it's less specific, probably the Yankees. By the way, I know nothing about baseball, but I have watched a shocking amount of Twins Yankees.
Over the years. A lot of it in fall and a lot of it ugly.
Yeah.
Damian Barrett asks, on one of the Bill Simmons podcasts, he hosts a, quote, Parents Corner slot. Could James also use his wealth of experience to do the same? Arif could offer counterpoints. As a new parent, I need all the help that I can get. Well, let me tell you what.
I love this idea. Hey, based on my experience raising a kid, I think this, and I'll be like, yeah, I don't have any experience, but screw that.
I like the idea of Arif offering counterpoints with no history of like kids or child care or anything like that.
Look, James, but I was once a kid. It doesn't sound that hard.
Like, fine, I'm coming to the cities with 5. We're gonna leave them at your apartment. Have batteries. We'll see you in like a week.
You're right. They do need something to whip at each other.
Yes.
Fair.
Well, that and for like every friggin' tablet or game system or whatever. It's yeah, like the idea of doing a parents.
You're sounding a lot like a parent right now. Your Nintendos and Xboxes and whatevers and your Dreamcasts.
Total side note. So last episode or the episode before, there was a question about like what shows should I be watching or what should we recommend now that Game of Thrones is done? And one of the examples was Letterkenny. And I can tell you that this is totally worth it. Letterkenny,
yeah, God, you're like the 8th person to tell me to watch this.
Yeah, Letterkenny is totally worth it. There's a ton of cursing for those that care about that sort of thing, but it is absolutely hilarious. And the fiance and I have been quoting it a lot. In fact, I'm actively trying not to quote it while doing this podcast. Like there are so many good inside joke lines from it that it's a bit hard to suppress, but it's totally worth it. Also from Damian Barrett, follow-up question, should I encourage my new daughter to support the Vikings or point her to support the local team of her birth, which is the Jets, which would be less painful for her in the long term? Boy, there's a...
wow.
There's I forget there's a Sophie's Choice or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's tough. Yeah. I would say that less painful is probably the Jets because they don't like give you that much hope, right? Like before they snatch it away.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the Vikings are good about once every 9 or 8 years. And
right.
then
It's like kicking the teeth bad stuff.
Oh yeah. The moment that you get to that certain point, after 9 or 8 years, then it just happens. So boy,
and in such like distinctive ways too. Like, yeah, there's a lot of missed kicks, right? Mm-hmm. But like, and which is like its own brand of whatever. And that's like tough. But like, they don't always disappoint you with a missed kick. They'll just get blown out, right? 41 donut, 38-7. I've been reminded 20,000 times today.
This is going to turn into that rant that Bomani Jones had about the history of the Falcons and all the ways they've blown it.
Yeah.
Like it's going to turn into that real quick.
Bomani, I think, is like...
he's from Atlanta.
An Atlanta native, so he's become kind of intimately familiar with that. Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of ways. And like the Saints game, which, by the way, we've got, I'm not going to say we've MST3K'd it, right? Is that what we want to say?
Close enough. Riff Tracks was also, Riff Tracks is the program that the Mystery Science Theater people came out after it was canceled. But yeah, we basically just did a running commentary of that.
Yeah. So which
I
actually
feel we exercised the demon there, and it may be why the Vikings ended up winning. I like to point to us as to the reason,
right.
For selfish reasons, obviously.
But despite the fact that it's a remarkably painful moment for any Vikings fan, we got a lot of positive feedback on that episode. So go back and listen to that. But
more comments about that than any other episode, with the possible exception of Property Brothers.
Property Brothers was pretty good too.
It's a 2D side scroller house. What is this?
But I mean, that had its own distinctive flavor, right? It was just like, oh, what are the Saints going to get away with that any other reasonable official in a game would call? And
what did it cost?
What's that pass interference on? Yeah, right. Yeah. So a lot of different ways it'll hurt you, and it doesn't even have to be in the playoffs. That Josh Freeman game had its own distinct flavor of pain, right? Like. The Giants were trying to help the Vikings too. It was remarkable.
Sometimes your star running back and future Hall of Famer just starts getting caught after beating his kids, and all of a sudden there's pictures of it on the internet, and he's just making things worse by talking about it.
Yeah. No. Phenomenal. Whereas, and the Vikings, I think since 2000 have led the league in arrests or whatever. A lot of different ways they can hurt you. The Jets, it's just like, well, there's the 09-010 run. Okay.
Yeah. Like you're not going to beat the Patriots for a little while, but if you can at least just kind of settle into being in the middle of 3/4 of the league, somewhere in there. But but to be fair, I don't know if I could, have my little girl cheer for a team that employs Greg Williams.
No, you're probably on a hiatus until Greg Williams, but you've probably got time. What has he got, a year?
What was the tweet that the Jets sent out today that a bunch of people were...
A culture over strategy.
Yeah, that's what it was. Culture over strategy. Because when I think culture, I think Greg Williams.
I think of Greg Williams, who has become infamous for the cultures he's created. Not just the one that got him suspended indefinitely from the league. Not just that culture, but also the toxic culture that resulted in like a murder-suicide of the Browns coaching staff. That culture.
Not as bad. That is not an overstatement of that situation.
Yeah, he Chris Christie'd that staff.
Yeah.
Which I guess is appropriate. He's at the Jets.
I'm waiting to see what his bridge scandal is going to be on this. It'll be great.
But it's not just that. It's also Adam Gase, who, if you'll recall, employed an offensive line coach that posted a video of him snorting a quote unquote a substance that appears to be cocaine and expressing his love for a sex worker. I believe he was married too. So that culture that got coaches fired for scandals, the culture that got other coaches fired for scandals, and another culture that got coaches fired for internal politicking.
Yeah, something like that.
That's the culture that's beating strategy. Cool. That's your Trump.
To be fair, sorry, Letterkenny thing. To be fair, if you are doing lines of coke, you're not expressing your love for a sex worker, then what are you really doing the coke for?
That's a good point.
There's rules to all of this. We're a bit off the topic. What was the original question? Was that should he be a Viking or
anyway? Wait like 2 years, then cheer for the Jets.
Yeah, my kid is in this weird, unhealthy balance of having a parent that's a Vikings fan and one that's a Packers fan, and really just go Vikings and just deal with it later. And when the divorce
deal with the trauma you're imposing on your child later.
When the kid gets older, they'll choose their own team, and it'll have more to do with colors than anything else. It won't have anything to do with Cam Newton as to whether or not he should be starting. It'll have to do with the fact that the blue is a pretty color. So just deal with it. And it has nothing to do with like gender on this. It has to do with the stupid friggin' color. Sorry, I've seen too many kids be like, oh, you're going to be a Vikings fan. You're going to be a Vikings fan. Like, no, I like the Chargers because they have a cool color. And you're like,
well, in fairness.
And I just assume that
they do.
I just assume that Phillip Rivers attracts, small.
He just accumulates children.
He just accumulates children. He doesn't actually help to give birth or like inseminate anything. He just attracts them like an evil Disney princess.
He just puts on the powder blues and they just populate.
And the face mask, apparently. The visor guard or something. Yeah.
Which I think someone tweeted out that the dark visor should be mandatory if you're in a Chargers uniform, which also a good take.
I'm not going to disagree with that one. Jonathan Judich. He's been a contributor to North Code for a long time. I feel like I should be able to pronounce his last name, but I'm not going to. He says, I asked a long time ago, but I don't recall the answer. When drinking from a bottle, do you drink it like it is a large straw or a tiny cup?
I feel like I've heard this question. I don't think I've answered it on this podcast. I go tiny cup. I think big straw is weird. I don't want to like make out with a bottle. But also it's unclear. I don't judge people who do the big straw. It just feels weird to me.
Yeah, I go tiny cup. But which is also to say, I forget which show it was, but they did point out that there's no real manly way to drink from a straw anyway. So like it's kind of a wash. Let's go with Luke Braun, who has a fantastic question. It says, what is Vikings Twitter in most denial about? Our version of there is no graphite in the ground from Chernobyl. What about the Vikings themselves? It's got to be the cap space, right?
Kind of. That might be my fault.
How is the cap space how is the graphite in the ground?
No. Okay, well, first of all, I had nothing to do with the disaster of Chernobyl, and I will sue anybody who says that I did. I want that to be clear.
I will take you to court.
Second, no, I think the being delusional about the cap space is my fault, not the cap space itself.
I was going to say that took a turn.
I do not have that much influence over the team, which is to imply I have any influence. I don't have any influence over the team. But I will say that when I kept tweeting that the cap is a myth as a joke about how good the Vikings are at fitting all these like high cost players under the cap, people just started tweeting out the cap is a myth. And now people will respond to my own articles about the constraints that the cap will create, or my own tweets about the constraints of the cap with the cap as a myth. And I'm not saying most of you aren't joking. Clearly, a lot of you are. But I'm concerned that some of you are not.
I feel like Andy is also part to blame in perpetuating this quote unquote myth.
Absolutely. But he's an amplifier of what I've created. It's problem. So that might be part of it, the idea that the cap is a myth. But I think most people, generally speaking, understand that the cap creates real problems. What are they actually in denial about? It'd be very easy to say Kirk Cousins, but actually I think a lot of people have a fairly reasonable final conclusion about him. I wouldn't say that everybody's kind of assessments of him are necessarily reasonable by themselves, because they'll talk about like winning or clutch games or prime time or whatever. And I actually think
4,000 yards.
Right. Yeah. But mostly people come to the conclusion that he's like kind of an average quarterback that needs a good supporting cast. And like, okay, I don't really care how you got here. Great. So they're not really delusional about Cousins. I guess you could say they're delusional about Thielen being a better receiver than Diggs, but it's like the difference is small enough anyway that it's like kind of difficult to say that that's a delusion and more like a reasonable disagreement about being wrong. What are they delusional about?
A reasonable disagreement about being wrong. Yeah.
But maybe Anthony Barr, like he's good. He's really good. You know, people hate him.
But he does love Minnesota, or at least enough to not sign with the Jets, which is still funny to us. Brad, BC Dad, asks the question, I fell off my bike, broke a rib, bruised my hip, and hit my head. Then the Raptors started winning in the NBA playoffs. Does this reversal of fortune for my physical health extend to the Vikings too, or does it only affect the Raptors, a team and sport I am disinterested in? Follow-up question. What sort of injury do I need to sustain in order to help the Vikings make it into the postseason? And does that injury have any location-specific requirements? Well,
I think it's got to be foot or leg related, just to kind of like bring you back into harmonic resonance with the kicker problems.
Yeah, it was either going to be that or like an ACL thing, and I think you're going to have to
actually, you know, it'd be great. A callback to, what was it, the 2013 season? No, it must have been 2015, actually. A pectoral tear.
Oh, ouch. Yeah. And I think you have to lose it in Seattle, where we'll be doing our live show that weekend before the game. So I think that is your location requirement for that.
Yeah.
Don from Ohio says, "Dear Arif and Billy, what do you give a father for Father's Day whose son is a trained cannibal by said father?" I have not trained any of the stepkids to be a cannibal. He merely mentioned
they're just emergent cannibals. Got it.
Well, yeah, there's intangibles there.
Yes.
There are intangibles, and cannibalism happens to be one of them. I will die on this hill. And be eaten later. He had merely said that he had made some comment about being a cannibal in his sleep. It doesn't mean he's actually doing that. Looking around quickly, what do you get a father for Father's Day? Get him a wallet. He's always going to end up needing a wallet. You never end up getting a wallet when you end up actually needing it, and then you end up having to buy it yourself, and you feel stupid because all you really wanted for the last couple of years for birthdays or for, little events like that is a wallet. I'm not saying this loud in the area of my fiance at all. Next question. Dear Arif and Jamiroquai.
Wow.
What is your go-to dessert for summer and why?
Wow. Virtual insanity shout out. Incredible. That's a great video, by the way.
Oh, 100%. When I was DJing, I used a picture of that for my first 90s night, and people would come up and be like, I don't really I don't want to be here very long, but could you play the song from the picture? Like,
I don't want to be here for very long. I'm just here for Jamiroquai.
It was the most honest thing that's ever been said to me in my entire life. When I can work within the constraints of this.
Sorry, what was the question?
The question: what is your go-to dessert for summer and why?
Oh, I don't have a go-to dessert, man. Chelsea and I did a thing where we would do a bunch of the creme brulees around Minneapolis, but it turns out those don't change very much, so we're done with that. By the way, pink peppercorn creme brulee that they had as part of a dessert rotation, I don't think they have it anymore, at Eli's East, so not Eli's downtown, but Eli's East, over by where we used to live in Northeast, was... I mean, it was good, but it was not the best one. But the reason I'm bringing it is because it was the most notable, because the pink peppercorn, the flavor was just like permeated throughout. And the pink peppercorn, by the way, is not the same species of like pepper, which I think is Piper nigrum, as like the black pepper that you get. And it's also not a Szechuan peppercorn, which would just be awful in a creme brulee. But it's kind of like its own flavor, but it is kind of reminiscent of pepper. I permeated the whole creme brulee. I'm never going to forget it. It was a good, maybe an above average one, but it was like weird. My go-to, I don't think I have a go-to dessert. I guess maybe during the summer I'm more likely to avoid like the heavy ones. Chelsea's not, though. She loves like chocolate flourless cakes and stuff like that, which are obviously like pretty dense. And I don't tend to like fruit in my desserts if there's chocolate in them that much. And so I'll always go in a different direction. But fruit seems to be the answer for like kind of a summer friendly dessert. So I don't really have a great answer to this.
If I'm going to like a barbecue or something and I have to bring a dessert, I will bring a watermelon that's kind of flavored like a mojito. I'll chop the pieces of the watermelon up, put salt on it, and lime juice and a couple other things, and that's pretty good. But really, I am quite simple and basic on something like that. I could be just fine with a strawberry shake from McDonald's for summer and be like, I'm good. And just it's gummy and it's not like overly like flavorful, but I'm convinced that there's some form of like an addictive like opiate in it, because enough people.
It's not that good, and the texture's not great. Anyway, I love it.
I do. I don't understand it. It's friggin' stupid.
That's kind of how I feel about the Shamrock Shakes every time they roll around. I'm like, this is way too sweet.
This is annoying as hell. I really should get a second one, though, because they're not going to have this out for another, like... I feel like if I get it now, I'll feel less stupid about it in 6 months when I'm thinking about having it. Be like, okay, I did have that second one, so... It's going to take more... I don't want my listeners to... I don't want my readers or my listeners to catch me in a McDonald's or something after all the hoity-toity food takes I've had. I'm speaking as Arif. So I have to make the most out of my McDonald's trip. So I need to make sure I have as many Shamrock Shakes in one sitting.
You're projecting a lot onto me, man.
I don't know what you're talking about at all. I
like McDonald's. Just because you're into hoity-toity food doesn't mean you can't be into food that you're like biologically hardwired. I mean, that's why McDonald's is successful.
McDonald's is successful because you don't have to show your face inside. You can just go through the drive-thru. And the only person who's going to judge you is the person taking your money at the first counter because he wanted you to be using a card and not trying to use all the coins that you have sitting in your little handle for the car door. He doesn't want to be counting any more than you do. He just wants to take the card. He's the only one judging you on that. I did have another question from Don, but we've already answered it. I just wanted to add that I enjoyed the opening of Dear Arif and Bismo Funyuns.
Incredible.
That top-notch work here. Arif, let's plug some of your work.
So I just finished the Q&A at The Athletic. That's still accessible, so you can take a look at all the questions people asked about minicamp, which just ended. I'm going to publish a piece on kind of how interesting the defensive tackle battle is for the Vikings pretty soon. And then I also recently published a scouting report of Alexander Mattison over at The Athletic that you can find.
Well, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. We hope you enjoyed it. If you do have any suggestions for the location of our live show in November, I believe it's going to be November 29th, please either email it to us at norsecodepodcast@gmail.com, or you can just send us a quick tweet or a DM, and we can take it from there. So, for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening, and please remember that revenge is a dish best served funky as hell. And we will see you soon. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.